Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Philosophy Association's video series accompanying the syllabus Philosophical Approaches to the Question of Palestine. Today, we will be talking about Unit 2 of the syllabus, covering two readings. We'll be talking about themes from two readings by Noam Chomsky and Edward Said. I'm AUGIE FALLER, and I'm a philosophy professor currently based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we have three others with us today, ZEYAD, MAEN, and RUBA. So why don't we do a round of introductions before we start our discussion, starting with ZEYAD.
Hi, everyone. My name is ZEYAD NABOLSY. I'm an assistant professor at York University in the philosophy department. I work mostly on African philosophy and the relationship between philosophy and anti-colonial movements in the 20th century.
Thank you. MAEN, why don't you go next?
Hello, my name is MAEN HAMMAD. I am a human rights researcher and campaigner, as well as a documentary photographer, currently based in Ramallah, Palestine. I'm Palestinian American.
And RUBA.
Hi, I'm RUBA AKKAD. I'm an assistant professor of contemporary multi-ethnic lit at Austin College, currently based in Texas. I specialize in Arab American literature, Palestinian studies, comparative ethnic studies, third world feminism, anti-colonial affect studies, and yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. We definitely appreciate you all joining for our discussion today. So the discussion today will be a supplementary discussion to the reading of the unit. We will give a very brief overview of some of the themes and then launch into a discussion that builds on these themes and draws out some questions from the readings. And we'll start with ZEYAD. So why don't you start us off in our discussion?
Thank you, Augie. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the two texts and maybe point out to some of the interesting philosophical issues or questions that arise when examining these two texts. So, I mean, obviously, the first thing to note is Chomsky and Said, they come from very different intellectual traditions. You can see in chapter 3 of Chomsky's Fateful Triangle, which is a massive book full of empirical claims, about 700 pages or so, and even that chapter is quite long. But Chomsky's approach is essentially to take the claims that he encounters either in liberal and conservative scholarship in the US, although he's primarily focused on liberals and mainstream leftists, to show that even those people are unwilling to admit anything such as the right of self-determination of Palestinians. And he takes that record and he does two things. He examines it against kind of extra textual facts, so facts as you can kind of encounter them in the wild, but he also traces internal inconsistencies. So you'll frequently see him, for example, saying, well, if this principle is adopted as a universal principle, then it would justify this absurd outcome. So he has this kind of internal critique of the texts he examines, and as well as an external one. And primarily his critique as well, these claims don't really correspond with the facts. Now, Said, of course, is quite sympathetic to this book, and he lauds it, in fact, clearly appreciating, the depth of empirical research that Chomsky does. But his qualms with Chomsky are more theoretical, because he takes Chomsky to be someone who thinks that it is possible to take one narrative and confront it with the facts to see or detect correspondence or lack thereof. Now, from Said's perspective, this appears to be quite naive, because one question, and this is an interesting philosophical question, is whether, we can kind of pick out facts independently of any narrative or independently of any interest, because presumably any kind of inquiry is motivated by some interest of some sort. Since it is simply impossible to just go around recording facts, there is always a question of relevance. Since if I just say I'm recording facts about Palestine, and even if I have a chronological marker from 1948 or something, well, I can't just go record facts about the fauna and flora of Palestine, although that could be relevant. But obviously there are objections that will arise. Well, actually, this is not relevant to this question. So the question of relevance doesn't seem to be directly addressed by Chomsky, according to Said at any rate. He simply, according again to Said, Chomsky has this kind of naive inductivist view where you can just go around collecting facts and you develop a picture of the truth. And in a sense, Said's qualms with Chomsky have to do with the fact that Chomsky, because he has this view of unadorned facts, is quite dismissive of any attempt to construct a Palestinian national narrative. So Chomsky is, I suppose we can describe Chomsky as a kind of cosmopolitan anarchist. And you'll see in the text, he has this deep contempt for people who he refers to as worshippers of the state and so on. Whereas Said thinks that there is something emancipatory, perhaps even necessary, about having a national narrative, especially for an oppressed people. And this, I think, leads to an interesting question as well, regarding whether all nationalisms are the same from a kind of axiological or even, moral normative viewpoint. Is the nationalism of the settlers morally equivalent to the nationalism of the oppressed population? So, and Chomsky is not explicit about this, but it seems he just has no room for any kind of notion of an emancipatory nationalism. So these are some of the issues, and there is, of course, the possibility to connect this with contemporary discussions in philosophy, especially in social epistemology, about hermeneutical injustice. Now, what's interesting, so I'm going to read Miranda Fricker's definition of hermeneutical injustice. So she defines it as the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. And we can have a really interesting discussion about whether this applies to this case, because you could say it's not the case that concepts like settler colonialism are unavailable. In fact, they're available to Palestinians. Palestinians have theorized about this deeply and have come up with competing theoretical accounts of what's happening on their land since, the late Ottoman Empire into the end of the 20th century. But we can talk about what happens if there is no uptake. Can we extend this concept? Can we extend the range of cases to which it is applicable? Okay, I'll stop here because this is fine. I think we can go in depth.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll pick up on a couple of themes briefly that just came up in your overview. Thank you for that. The first that you brought up, this issue of just presenting the facts. It reminds me of the philosopher Louise Antony writes about this, and she likes to use the example of the old TV show Dragnet, in which the Detective Friday, will pause the witness and say, "Just the facts, ma'am." Just the facts. Like, we don't want your story, we want just the facts. And Antony is very critical of this, right? Because she points out that we know now from philosophy of science and that there isn't any objective perspective, really any perspective from nowhere. And Antony argues that instead of trying to get rid of all biases or perspectives, which is impossible, we should be looking for the right biases. And she's not like an anti-realist who's going to say, there's no facts, there's just perspective. She's going to say, no, all the facts are interpreted through a perspective, and you can have better and worse. And I thought it was really interesting that Said cites Hayden White, who's a theorist of history, who talks about narration and history as metaphor, and makes this point that, yeah, history, if history is something like telling a story about what happened that's supposed to give some explanation, some kind of to help us understand the past and understand how we got to the present, then that's going to require stringing together certain facts, and Chomsky certainly does that, right? Uh, so I think Saeed's point is very good that we can't just look at the facts. We have to understand that our interpretation of the facts is through some perspective. Maybe they're better and worse perspectives, both in terms of how accurate they are and in terms of moral considerations, right? Are they reinforcing justice, addressing exploitation and oppression, or are they reinforcing oppression and subtler colonialism in this case? Uh, and yeah, I don't have too much more to say about that, but I think that's a really important point that connects well with both these general points in philosophy of science and in philosophy of history. And on the issue of epistemic injustice, I thought, yeah, there's a really nice connection here to that literature, in that so far as there seem to be both instances of testimonial injustice in which a speaker is given an unjust credibility deficit. They're not believed what they're saying because of their identity. Fricker focuses on examples like women not being believed, or people in the US context, Black people not being believed. And it seems to apply really well to this case in Saeed's discussion, that there's this problem that in this case, Palestinians are not given the opportunity, they're not given credibility to talk about their own experience, which is very apparent in the current news, right? That whenever something is reported on, it's always questioned when it's from a Palestinian source, and rarely from the Israeli source, or if ever. So it has a sort of built-in testimonial injustice structurally in the news. And interestingly, right, Chomsky himself gives a great explanation of that in his book Manufacturing Consent with Herman, Edward Herman. Right? And on hermeneutical injustice, I'll just make one more comment that I find it really interesting that in Fricker's example, she gives the example of sexual harassment in the workplace, that before the 1970s, there wasn't really a concept available to people. People knew, like, this is bad behavior, this person's being handsy, or what they're doing is wrong. But there wasn't a really useful concept to label it and in particular bring legal action until the case of Carmina Wood at Cornell University, that in the early 1970s, in which some law professors developed a legal case to claim that there's a specific form of harassment happening in the workplace, sexual harassment. And that made it possible for people to make sense of their experience and to organize around it and get recourse for it. And that case, the way Fricker presents these cases is that people don't have the ability to make sense of their own experience. They don't have the ability to see that other people are experiencing the same thing in a really useful way. And that seems very different, as you brought up, ZEYAD, in this case, because there is a lot of collective understanding of what's happening, but there's not uptake in the broader context. And it's interesting that it depends how we read the definition, that Fricker says obscured from the collective understanding owing to a structural identity prejudice. So to me, there's an interpretation of the definition that collective means like everybody, in which case, yeah, this seems to be a case of hermeneutical injustice that is being described by Saeed, that there is an uptake. But Fricker's own use of the term seems that she's thinking that in a more narrow sense that that maybe that there's not really any uptake. So I think there's a really interesting philosophical question here, but is there something different than hermeneutical injustice going on? And if so, how should it be defined? Or maybe Fricker's own description of hermeneutical injustice focuses too much on particular cases in which the individual also doesn't really have access to the concept. I think that's a really interesting, broader question for students and philosophers and everybody to think about. Any other thoughts from anybody on our discussion so far? In a moment, we'll turn to MAEN and RUBA to talk some about their work, but before we move on, Zaya, do you have anything to add, or anybody else want to pick up on anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to make a very brief comment about testimonial injustice, and what we are witnessing today. So, yeah, of course, you have this uh, question of unjustifiedly not believing certain people or not taking them to be reliable conveyors of the truth. But you also have injustices in another case where you give too much credibility to certain sources, right? So, and actually Chomsky, and I can't remember if it's in this chapter or in another chapter, but he has a really interesting take on, for example, somebody like Michael Walzer's account of Israel's wars in general, in relation to his theory of just war, where Walzer just takes basically the word of the Israeli soldiers that they protected their purity of arms or whatever, which of course in any other investigative context you wouldn't just uncritically take the words of the belligerent party and provide it as evidence that in fact there were no violations. So I just thought that's interesting also to think about it from the other perspective. Um, and the other thing, just very briefly on hermeneutical injustice in relation to the existence or non-existence of concepts. I mean, it could be the case that you also have people who have, for example, access to the concept of colonialism, but they just don't think it applies to particular cases. So the extension kind of the concept of colonialism in one context, they think, well, but it doesn't apply to Israel, for example, because colonialism is something we talk about in the 19th century. It ended in the mid-20th century. So I think that might be an interesting thing to think about as well.
Thank you. Yeah, those are both really interesting points. And on the issue of testimonial injustice, I want to add there is a kind of, so in the case of hermeneutical injustice, there's some questions about whether Fricker's definition really applies or whether it might apply, and maybe she just wasn't thinking about this kind of case, or maybe it doesn't apply and there's some other kind of interesting injustice happening. I think likewise with testimonial injustice, actually, your comment made me think, because the way she describes testimonial injustice is based on an identity prejudice. So she's thinking like in her case of To Kill a Mockingbird, she uses this example from fiction, but the white jury is prejudiced, so they don't see the defendant as a good source of information. But in Chomsky's work on manufacturing consent, I mean, they make kind of a political economy argument that there are these structures in place in the media such that certain sources are just not going to be considered good sources. And it's not really because of individual prejudice, it's because of economic structures in place. For instance, if the New York Times starts questioning military sources, they're just going to lose access to military sources. But they don't have the economic means to have a source everywhere, so they need to be able to access like Pentagon sources. So it doesn't, and then there's this ripple effect outward from that, how they're going to treat Israeli sources. If they want to get access to certain information in order to sell their news, they have to treat them as credible. It is, I mean, it's a lot more in depth than that, but that's the basic argument. And what's interesting there is they don't have to appeal to individual prejudice at all. I think they, in fact, attempt not to, because they don't want to say that the reason the news is so biased is because a bunch of people are racist. They want to say, no, it's the economic structure of the news that determines this. So it's actually kind of unclear whether that would count as testimonial injustice, either the credibility excess given to, like in this case, the Israeli soldiers, or the credibility deficit given to Palestinians and activists and people, eyewitness accounts on the ground, because it's unclear whether it's really because of identity-based prejudice. Of course, it kind of again depends. Maybe Fricker means those terms in a broader sense. She does say early on in the book it can operate purely structurally, but her cases don't necessarily bring that out again. That it could be a structural identity prejudice in the sense of an economic structure that makes it the case that certain sources are not treated as credible. So I think there are a lot of interesting ways in which this topic, I think, can help grow our understanding of these issues in social epistemology. It's really interesting. and troubling, of course. Yeah. Any other thoughts? If anybody wants to jump in, still have a little bit of time, or we can move on. I think it's really
I
fascinating.
can.
Yeah, Ma.
I think it's to your point about like the contemporary use of this conversation and this and the points that you all are bringing up is important. Um, I feel like it's the most you can see it so starkly now, especially since October 7th with everything that's going on. And I've kind of been fascinated by how many people I've known from my US setting who sort of knew so little or nothing about Palestine. And then over, these last 10, 11 months have sort of had this, sort of boot camp of understanding that I thought would have been impossible, if you would have asked me a year or two ago. And it's not to say that everybody has 100% sort of understanding or they'll ever reach this question of 100%, but I've been intrigued by it, and I think um, I wonder if it's more powerful than the alternative, very powerful sort of testimonial injustice that has been entrenched for decades about the caliber or worthiness of a Palestinian voice. And I think about this within human rights frameworks. So, for example, um, Palestinians have been saying settler colonialism, since before 48. They've been saying apartheid since apartheid became a sort of legal and international justice sort of term and used it actually in the early 2000s to start the Boycott National Committee and the BDS movement. Um, and it wasn't until sort of mainstream human rights organizations sort of gave it this rubber stamp, right? Like, oh, the Amnesty and Human Rights watches of the world being able to say it with a Western institutional mythology that sort of can rubber stamp this. But I wonder how um, the worthiness of that framework when you're seeing such a stronger sort of organic grassroots pushback that's been going on, that's telling stories very much from the voice of Palestinians, and in this case, especially from Gaza, who on their smartphones are, uh, given this unfortunate reality where they're self-narrating their genocide and live streaming it for the masses to see. Um, but it's interesting because I think the use of genocide as a word, because it has an international legal framework, but Palestinians have been saying and acknowledging this slow genocide for decades and the very fast and kinetic genocide that we're all seeing in front of our eyes. Um, and I would not be surprised if in, 5, 10 years from now, there will be rubber stamped human rights reports that acknowledge the very facts that Palestinians have been saying, that don't have law degrees, that are not barristers in international legal justice courts or mechanisms. But um, in a way, I look to this because it's quite powerful just to see how quick that shift has happened and um, to to witness a little bit of this testimonial justice, perhaps, about people mostly in the global north or the west, watching videos or entering Telegram channels or Signal groups or WhatsApp groups outside of the sort of hyper securitized and surveilled mainstream or sort of legacy media world. And um, that that is something that I think I wish that, Edward Said and Chomsky could speak to their conversation, their sort of back and forth and right within this current framework, because I wonder how much of that would fall flat or would hold true still.
Definitely, yeah, those are great points, and the effect of it's now so recognized the effect of social media and how that has changed, in some ways, as you're pointing out, really changed the public perception. On the other hand, hasn't yet put a stop to the current genocide. So there's a kind of paradoxical situation here. Yeah. So why don't maybe we turn to Ruba and we shift gears a little bit. And if you want to talk about some of your work and its connection to these issues of narration, permission to narrate, telling stories from a particular perspective, Palestinian perspective, or a perspective, whatever, yeah, whatever you would like to share and how it connects to these themes and what you were thinking when thinking about ZEYAD and some of these topics.
Okay. Yeah, so my work is, I am a literary scholar, so I'm very interested in stories. But I also have a very broad definition of literature, and a lot of this has been resonating with my work. I explore sort of this term I call occupied joy, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but essentially what my work tries to do, I explore, for example, Palestinian skateboarding as a subculture, as a scene. I also explore Palestinian women's poetry and mothering as this concept, and Palestinian graffiti and murals, the act of like communal upkeep, as forms and sites of what I call occupied joy. And I'm seeing this, especially after reading this, and speaking with y'all, I'm seeing this as a form of resistance to that epistemic injustice. And yeah, so I kind of look to these everyday, mundane sort of in-betweens, to find moments of hope that I call like ruptures of coloniality. And I was resonating with Said's sort of gripe with Chomsky's narration, because that's kind of how I came to my work. I came to find this real sense of like pessimism, and defeatism, both in academia, but also just the sort of general public's psyche. And of course, this was also all before this latest reiteration of genocide. But yeah, I was really seeing that defeatism, when people largely theorize and narrate from this point of death and ontological abjection only. And so, with like every few, the cycle of aggression happens, and then it sometimes makes it to Western mainstream media, and then it's this flooding of images of suffering, and death that sort of sticks in I would say largely I'm thinking more of the Western public psyche here. And then, the humanitarian framework that MAEN was also talking about kind of takes that and creates this narrative only of just that, where in a sense, then that dehumanizes Palestinians as a totalized victim, who just needs, aid that will not liberate, right? And so I think, yeah, I was recognizing these sort of spectacles, and I didn't want to also like, right, it's not to negate the suffering, but to sort of widen the lens and like thinking about the potentials, the liberatory potentials of what that could do. And so that's why I kind of look to these in-between moments, and I try to theorize and narrate from what I call a point of life and being. So I'm borrowing a little bit from Black studies scholars like Kevin Kwashi, who thinks about aliveness, and this sort of just, it also speaks to Indigenous American, like survivance, resurgence, these theories of thinking and narrating through life, rather than only death when it comes to oppressed communities. So yeah, I'm interested in how wide the lens of bearing witness can stretch, and what that means for collective liberation, and looking at the quotidian, these everyday in-betweens. And I think there is sort of a blueprint for us to look at shared resistance, survival, and healing. So Occupy Joy it's a work in progress, but it's a theory, lens, framework, analytic, and also a practice, what I call a world making that is characterized by an expansive understanding of life through this alternative way of being. And I think it gives us like an explanatory power around affective resistance. So I think of it as coming from this desire, like I said, to do more than just survive. to heal and exist and resist and live in a way that ruptures coloniality. And I think there's levels to it, but I'm trying to give the sort of condensed version here. I focus a lot on embodied resistance in relationship to the psychological resistance. And then I think about the psychological warfare, where I think about the pessimism aspect and kind of Said's gripe with Chomsky. And I was also thinking of like Basil al-Araj's, he has these eight rules. I'm forgetting which text it's from, but, you know, like thinking about believing and spreading the Zionist entities' points in the media, and I think about the pessimism and the defeatism that comes with that, and so there's lots of connections here. But yeah, I think about Occupied Joy as holding joy and struggle together, and widening that lens, and also I've named it such to also warn against like a romanticization of joy, and also to differentiate it from the Western capitalist individualist sort of practice of joy. And so this is a joy that holds, you know, pain and suffering and trauma together. It's entangled, and it's not depoliticized, defanged in any way. And so that's why I think about things like skateboarding, where Palestinian youth are self-narrating, self-theorizing their liberation through skateboarding, and, you know, thinking about the ways it resists the psychological effects of occupation, including also the physical, right, freedom of movement. And I don't know if like Man wants to talk more about this because he has a lot of really great work about this. But I guess I'll stop there because I could ramble for a lot longer.
Yeah, thank you. That's super, I mean, really interesting and valuable. I want to take a couple brief comments about some things I picked up and see what others think. I mean, I really like the connection to the points about pessimism in the reading. Said talks of the Chomsky exhibits a kind of both pessimism of the intellect and pessimism of the will, going back to Zayad's earlier points that he just doesn't really think that there's any hope in a kind of nationalist project, or that it's going to end well, and he focuses on it's basically bad stuff happening. It's all bad. It's like, and part of the one thing I was taking from what you were saying, or something I was thinking about, is just the extent to which that kind of pessimism does serve the dominant interests in this case. That if there's this kind of, you know, unending struggle and violence, and there's no hope for any kind of resolution, then why would you be motivated to try to intervene? You wouldn't be. And it's, I mean, analogies could be that, like, defeatism about climate change. Well, it's just inevitable. I mean, we're facing climate, so why try to change it? You know, just you know, embrace embrace the apocalypse. So I think it's really valuable to challenge the pessimism and the constant cynicism of the news cycle, and focus on ways in which, yeah, as you so nicely put, like new worlds are being made, or there's these people are creating their own space for new possibilities, and the importance of everyday narration of one's own experience, as you're saying, like through everyday like expressions of joy or graffiti, or what, like when I visited Palestine and spent a lot of time at the skate park there as a skateboarder who volunteered with Skate Pal. I mean, it left a big impression on me that how much of the graffiti was very positive and focused on building something new, like some kind of different way of being out from under this really oppressive environment. I mean, literally, I was at the skate park, and a Israeli helicopter flew right over, like buzzing us at one point, and so they're literally just above, like in this very literal way, but those kids are still having a good time and able to find their own niche there. So I'm not saying as well as you did, but yeah, I really like those points. Anybody else want to jump in on some of what Ruba was saying?
I really like the framework you use is so not just a cliche one that talks about joy, as you said, sort of in a defanged way, just because I think, especially having grown up in the diaspora, like the relationship to Palestine is very much like philosophical, ironically. Like it's much more of an idea as opposed to something really tangible. And it took me quite some time to sort of be in Palestine in the occupied West Bank and sort of um, have my own self debates about like the parts of my Americanness that I needed to sort of defang and learn or understand within this sort of Palestinian context. And I think there's so many examples of this sort of joy making and world making and community that is not just fluffy, sort of individualistic centers of joy, but instead very much communal or collective or frustrated or angry, that ends up being actually much more powerful in terms of how it actually gets replicated in the real world, because you see a sort of community building or a collective making that sort of has the rules of the terrain, which is like, yeah, death and violence and you know, surveillance and all of the real world implications of settler colonialism are still very real, but there's a way that you can create these portals to not have them distract you fully. And it isn't to say you negate them and you exist in a bubble that doesn't allow you to see them. You actually are seeing them quite clearly, but you're deciding to just breathe for a moment. And especially within the sort of counterculture movements and things related to that, I think Ruba and I shared a panel actually talking about skateboarding at a skateboard conference in Arizona. And I don't think I ever had such an easy time explaining the real world implications of occupation than speaking to about like 200 skaters who sort of are in and of themselves space makers and in the street and fully cognizant of the pitfalls of our world, who have no connection to Palestine, might not actually even know where it is on a map, but could sort of relate in a way that um, was pretty powerful, right? Like they didn't need to be reading Chomsky or Said, but they could understand from Palestinian skaters the sort of lived reality, which I think that creation of a joy-making space is it's not just exclusive to Palestine or Palestinians, but it's amazing when um, you can see sort of these like the power of defragmenting Palestinians from other struggles by showing, you know, glimpses of joy or glimpses of these sort of moments of sort of space making for good.
Can I jump in and also just, yeah, this idea of like the defragmentation and the isolation of Palestine from like an international struggle. I was really thinking about that with the epistemic injustice, the hermeneutical injustice, because I'm thinking about, because like in this case, right, I kind of sometimes also see it as looking at the audience's perspective, right? Because Palestinians always have the permission to narrate. It's more so, does this get taken up, like you said, Augie, like in the public uptake of it, right? Where there might be authority to actually do something. So I'm thinking about the audience's perspective and the act of like witnessing and the limits of it versus I'm forgetting who it is. There's this scholar, this Black Studies scholar. I'm gonna look it up. I need to name her. She has this concept called witnessing, and it's more being with the what you're witnessing, right? And I think about that with like things like international solidarity versus like joint struggle, and seeing all of these struggles as connected, not just on this basis of like parallels, but also this basis of literally fighting the same systems. Yeah, I'm just thinking about that with what MAEN was talking about, with like these skaters being able to recognize this, despite not like fully like even being able to point to Palestine on a map. But yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to also just briefly mention something about joy, because I thought it's interesting in relation to the Chomsky reading in particular, because he gives all of these examples of Zionist depictions of Palestinians as having, no particular emotional involvement in their environment, in their physical environment. Um, and of course, it's not a question of accepting this assumption that emotional attachment to the land is a necessary condition for having occupancy rights or something, because that sounds a bit strange. But even on the premise of this argument, I think there is a way in which one is also challenging a certain depiction of Palestinians as having, as not having any emotional investment in the land, and the seasonal changes in the land and so on. So I think that's also very interesting.
I'll jump in. Is that okay? Okay. I don't know if anyone had a hand up. Yeah, I think along those lines, I was thinking about so Rafat Al-Hariri, Allah yarhamah, had this TED talk that he did like 8 years ago, talking about storytelling, the power of storytelling, and connecting it to literally how it can connect you to your land. And he does this a lot in his work everywhere, in his teaching. And I've been really thinking about that because I recently taught that TED talk. And I think, that's sort of one of the big threats of having permission to narrate is having this connection to a homeland more than just in the imaginary, and having that in the public sort of view of like what Palestine, the narration of Palestine. I don't know if that made sense. I need to reword that maybe.
Well, one thing that makes me think of is Said does early on, I think, use the term authority too. He switches to permission, but he talks about who's seen as having the authority. And I think the kind of the effect of some of this rhetoric about, well, Palestinians don't even have a connection to their land, or they can, is partly, I mean, that may not the only function, but partly to say you don't have the authority to speak on the land or something. And so maybe one, I mean, I don't know if this is the right way to think about it, but one effect of demonstrating this kind of connection, or demonstrating the capacity for joy, or for, is to demonstrate an authority over one's own experience. Again, that the authority to say, like, well, I do have a connection. I'm doing these things. I'm connecting in this way. So you should listen to me, which shouldn't be necessary, of course. I mean, it shouldn't be like, it shouldn't be a condition on listen. But in the current non-ideal situation we're in, it maybe plays some function. It's important strategically to establish that, maybe, or for someone to point that out, to say, no, they, of course, they're authorities on their connection to this land and their own experience, and you can see it by seeing it in this way. I don't know if that's helpful, but some thought. a thought that struck me. Why don't we shift gears a little bit, just in the interest of time, and you have Man talk through some of your work and how it relates, and we can, of course, keep weaving in these different topics.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I can start by saying I'm a sort of lover of photography and storytelling in the sort of visual sense, but it's been a sort of self-learning process that happened ironically after I graduated undergrad. I went back to Palestine for the first time as an adult, and I historically have been a skater, never too good, but something that I've always sort of had as my own little portal into this world of mine. And I ended up moving back to Palestine in 2014 to take this Arabic course, and sort of stumbled into skateboarders randomly, which sort of like did this whole paradigm shift in my head because um, part of my relationship to Palestine, like I said, was quite a diasporic one, which kind of just meant that I was there in Palestine as a young child with my parents in the summers, um, without very much space to sort of narrate what that trip even looked like. It was sort of, you go to your grandpa's house, you go to your grandma's house, you go to your aunt's house. If Jerusalem is open, you go to Al-Aqsa, and then you go home back to Michigan. So when I went by myself, I sort of saw this world that um, was really sort of unbelievable. And part of it was tied to this sort of small community of skateboarders who at the time were sort of just starting to kickstart this small and intimate skate scene. And I began photographing and have been working on this long-term body of work called Landing, which looks at the sort of radical underpinnings of skateboarding in the occupied West Bank within this framework or this question of escape. Like, can skateboarding sort of serve as an escape to this headspace of violence? And the work itself sort of probes this question. I don't think I leave an answer to it. And lots of it is sort of a sort of attempt to be quite collective in terms of this production of work. Like I do interviews with the skaters. I gave the skaters disposable cameras and allowed them to sort of photograph their world without prompting them and incorporate them into this hopeful photo book. So that work has been ironically quite philosophical about skateboarding and space and escape, like this sort of trifecta of questions that I sort of probe into. And more recently, since October 7th and the ongoing genocide, I've spent some time in the occupied West Bank, and I just moved back actually a week ago, and have been photographing this project that I don't think I have a title for just yet, but it's about this idea of defragmentation, especially post-Oslo, and looking at the different areas of the occupied West Bank into in how they sort of visually tell the story of both fragmentation and defragmentation. So one of the parts of this work is called Area D, which is looking at this alternative area, which for those listening who don't know the sort of dynamics of the occupied West Bank post-Oslo, the West Bank has been split into three different areas with different levels of sort of control by the Israeli regime and the Palestinian Authority. So Area A is sort of fully under the Palestinian Authority, which sort of acts as this de facto authority that rules small little pockets or Swiss cheese balls of the apartheid reality in the West Bank. Area B is a sort of mixed, and Area C is sort of under total Israeli control. And Area D is looking at this alternative reality where Palestinians are actually defragmenting themselves. And part of it is with active resistance, all the different types of resistance, whether it's sort of militant or building in different areas that they're not allowed to build, or the different sort of ways that Palestinians are actually defragmenting this post-Oslo reality, especially within the context of Gaza and not allowing the sort of narration and story of Palestinians to be sequestered into Gaza as its own little entity and the West Bank as its own entity. And part of that is really because of my own frustration of seeing how strategic and well placed Oslo has been in fragmenting Palestinians. And I don't think that's new to anybody on this panel or this call, but we still it's wild to still be hearing talking points about Oslo and a peace process. And I can't help but think of there is this other world that Palestinians are living in, which is this what I call Area D, which is completely not looking at Oslo within this reality of a bar to reach or a hopeful sort of ideal, but instead one that they're actively resisting, and one that they're resisting against the behest of the powers that be, whether that is the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli regime, the Western backing of the EU, the Americans, and etc. So I work on these projects mostly out of just my own frustrations and curiosity. The skateboarding project just out of being a skater and sort of having all these interesting questions I wanted to sort of answer. And I guess one thing that makes my work a little bit different than sort of normal quote unquote documentary photography is that I sort of refuse to just have images on them by themselves. I think there is a documentary photography world where, a nice book of 52 images with no text can tell a story. But in the context of Palestine, I feel like text actually in many ways is more important than the photo or the pixels that my camera is taking. And landing has been this sort of practice of trying to really probe these questions that I've had sitting in my head, where this hopeful photo book sort of has critical text, poetry, interviews, like I said, while the photos themselves sort of act as a shadow and help the story find its place. But in a way, you can read this work without the photos, or you can read the work without the text, which I think goes back to this sort of idea of self-narration. And I obviously have to note that, like, as a Palestinian American, I have a much different lived reality than most of the Palestinians here in the occupied West Bank. So I find these long-winded questions that take me sort of years to sort of probe as really important benchmarks for my own practice, both within photography and writing.
Can I jump in? I just love Man's work. And I was thinking, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, I think Edward Said says this at some point, like Palestine, yes, Palestinians, no. When he's talking about, I think this is the example he gives with something with the UN. He was like tasked to do some kind of census, and it was like rejected, right? Because it was too much about Palestinians rather than just Palestine as this, I guess, fragmented geopolitical entity. And I just, yeah, I think like, man, your work is so important because it speaks back to this Palestine, yes, Palestinians, no. And it's, again, narration and self-narration and the way you like literally just gave Palestinian skaters cameras for them to also take photos of their lives, I think unsettles this sort of documentary type of photography that you're also speaking of. And I don't know, I was just really thinking about that. Palestine, yes, Palestinians, no. And sort of this idea of like nothing about us without us. And I think like similarly as like a diaspora kid, I'm always, cognizant of that. And like, I don't think in my work, like I'm really doing anything other than trying to uplift the voices that are already self-narrating. And I think like for me, I just try to construct sort of an archive of this in written work, going back to, I guess, the epistemic injustice of like, these are like, this is already happening. They're like, Palestinians are already documenting all of this, but it gets, it doesn't get taken up, right, in these public discourses because of authority, power, absences in the archive, all of this. So yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were speaking.
Go ahead, Zayad, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, related to these points, I was also thinking that this issue of the matter in which, sorry, the manner in which um, certain claims then get, wider circulation, and they become, as it were, credible when they're taken up by mainstream, if you like, human rights organizations and so on, is also related to this question of facts and narrative and the possibility of facts without narratives, because frequently what happens is they get taken up as facts but are situated in a different narrative. So whether, perhaps originally they're framed by Palestinians in terms of part of a political project, emphasis on political rights, a right to self-determination, and maybe these same facts, facts about, for example, settlement encroachment and so on, can then be treated by these mainstream organizations as part of a narrative of human rights encroachments, right? But kind of depoliticized, no claims to national self-determination. So I think that goes a bit to Said's point, I believe, about facts by themselves. It's almost an underdetermination problem. You need something more.
Yeah, and to jump off of that, because I feel like I work within the sort of human rights world and I have a lot of grievances towards it, but I feel like facts in and of themselves can actually be weaponized to the behest of the occupied. It's not even just if there's a question of if facts in and of themselves can do good, but there's also this question of facts can actually do wrong when you're putting all of those facts into one basket of eggs that institutionally or systematically is not in your favor. And I mentioned this in terms of, the international human rights frameworks where, those who wrote the laws, the international laws and humanitarian legal frameworks that we think of today are ex-colonial states that wanted to have some layers and limits of protection for their own violations and crimes and psyches, and for an entity like the Palestinian Authority to believe that the ICC or the Rome Statute is the savior is a faulty reasoning, because you get stuck in the bureaucracy of these regimes, which in a sort of bureaucratically violent way that takes your facts and leaves the victims of human rights atrocities sort of on the margins and continues to further marginalize Palestine from its own perseverance of liberation and justice.
Yeah, I think this is also not a wall I'm hitting, but just this point of I'm still thinking through the limitations of this because of the past 11 months, right? Is that okay? There are these narratives now, and we know like the Zionist entity targets the people who are putting forth these narratives. I think of like Rifat as like doing this, creating an army of people who are narrators with his work, and that's why he was targeted. And so it's that facts, when they finally do kind of have this narration, and it is getting taken up a little bit by, let's say, like the general public, but then again, it's that limit of the authority, I guess like institutional aspect of like, they can always say in their like state press conferences, like oh, well, we're still gathering the facts. Oh, we're gonna ask them to investigate, right? It's like this wall I'm hitting almost where I'm working through it. And yeah, thinking through those limitations.
Thank you all for sharing. Maybe we should have some concluding thoughts now in the interest of keeping the video a manageable length. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, though, and very fruitful, and hopefully those watching will find it an excellent supplement to the readings in this unit. So maybe we could do a round of concluding thoughts. Does that sound good to everybody? Just anything that you kind of are still thinking about or would like to add. Um, I can just start by saying, yeah, I think this has been really interesting discussion, and I'm really happy that we were able to get together and share from these different perspectives, both in life and academically or in work. And I think it's really fruitful to bring these different perspectives together. I think, yeah, there are some really great philosophical connections to build on this discussion to philosophy of science and philosophy of history and the question of facts versus their context in which they're presented. Zeyad brought up the issue of underdetermination of theories by evidence, that the facts alone won't determine how to interpret them, and they can be put in these different frameworks. And one kind of, I think, an interesting resource to look at for this in the context of human rights that I'm curious about if you've encountered is Robert Meister's book After Evil, in which he makes this argument that there's kind of a fundamental problem with UN human rights discourse, because the UN, in the same kind of time that they were putting out like the Declaration of Human Rights, they also were creating the state of Israel, recognizing it as so that it's kind of a self-undermining narrative that created an exception that undermines the overall narrative of human rights. And his work is very critical about that. So Robert Meister might be an interesting direction to take some of this discussion for students. And yeah, so I'll pass it off. Just a couple of thoughts that struck me. Uh, to maybe I'll pass it to Zeyad, and then we can go around to Man and then finish with RUBA.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one really interesting thing to think about, which we didn't really get into too much detail in, but maybe if students are using this, is to, try to figure out what's the narrative that Chomsky is building, for instance. What's his own interest in this? So, of course, there is an interest in the truth, which is apparent, but, humans are not just interested in the truth. They want to do something with it. So in some places, it seems that Chomsky, for instance, wants to save the save US citizenry from their complicity in this. In other places, he actually seems to be having an interest in saving Israel, the state of Israel. So there is also Chomsky's, the question of Chomsky's own connection to that political project, which Said touches on when he talks about the way Chomsky talks about self-determination in historic Palestine. So that's something that I thought was interesting to do that kind of excavation, if you will. And I'll pass it on to Man.
Yeah, it's as a non-philosopher, it's been nice to share this space and this combo. I've learned a lot from both the readings and where this combo's gone, so I'm excited for where students might be able to take it further. The timing of it and this question of this testimonial injustice, I think about it a lot, and I guess where and how, like I wonder what testimonial justice would actually be for Palestinians. Like I think I was just in Jenin, which as of yesterday was under siege by the Israelis for 10 days in one of the largest sort of military incursions in the last 2 decades. And I sort of went in with my own headspace of like, wow, this is going to be so hard and troubling and down. And I sort of left, like, ironically, really optimistic, mostly just because of the perseverance of our people and just how alive they are in the face of death and like very real violence that leaves no one sort of unscathed. And I'm now back in the Ramallah area, which is this completely different bubble, which it's a weird sort of contradiction to be in sort of area A, like I was saying in my talk. But I find that like the justice part that I think might exist is much more in places like Jenin, where you're hearing their stories coming, straight after the withdrawal, and the story of the camp and its resilience and its resistance as something so believable for the people that isn't in question of fact or not. And in a place like Area A here in Ramallah, there's all these question marks and hypotheses around resistance and state making and all these other questions. And I feel like it's actually ironically much more refreshing to go to the belly of the beast to see it, which is, absolutely nothing compared to what's going on in Gaza and the very real warfare that's taking place there. But I look towards places like that for this semblance of what testimonial justice might be. And I think this conversation has allowed me to sort of understand that in a way.
I don't know that I can say anything that hasn't already been said, but I really do. I learned so much from this convo. I think I want to leave students with just like something to ruminate on as we're thinking about epistemic injustice and hermeneutical injustice and bearing witness and thinking about the complicity of this audience that takes up these narrations. I think I just want to leave students with something to reflect on and maybe challenge themselves on, is thinking about what is asked in action of bearing witness versus witnessing, and thinking about that in whatever way it makes sense to these students.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent way to end. So we'll end our recording there and encourage everybody to take up these questions moving forward. Thank you. And thank you all so much for joining us in this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.